Okay. Hello, hello. I'll be presenting the public keyword. If you want the copy of the slides, that's a QR code. Yeah. So I'm going to start with a little interactive bit. I've got two questions here. The first is base.isExpr part of the public API of Julia? Could I get a show of hands? Who thinks that base.isExpr is part of the public API of Julia? Who thinks it is not part of the public API? Okay, so we're split about maybe 40-60 with a slight majority saying it's not part of the public API. Love that, love that. Great for that kind of ambiguity. What about base.print matrix? Is that part of the public API? Yes? Is it not part of the public API? Ooh, it seems like more people think this one's not. Maybe it's like 80-20 not part of the public API. Okay, this is not particularly satisfying. We should know what the public API is. We don't have computers in front of us. We're just off the top of our heads. But how would you know? Is anyone really confident in their answers? I'll tell you the right answer is base.isExpr is part of the public API and base.printMatrix is not part of the public API. Is anyone, like maybe someone who got it right for one of them, how did you know? Yes. I heard we use the first one and we don't use the second one. That's, so tragically, we do actually define public API in some part based on whether it's used in the package ecosystem. We use package eval to run semi-breaking changes on Julia, test all the packages, see if it actually breaks things. And that really does inform a lot of how we decide whether something's too breaking or not, which is not ideal because we also want to be able to add internals and confidently know that they're internal and we can change them later. So yeah, yeah, and does anyone have an authoritative way of finding out the right answer to this? I heard ChatGPT, and that is an incorrect answer. So this is unsatisfying. And the solution, before we get into the solution. So a little bit of background here. We want to communicate to users, and this we is the Julia base, and it's also packages. Package authors want to communicate to their users what can be depended upon. And that is documenting the current behavior and also whether that behavior will change in the future. And it's pretty common to say this whole set of behaviors, the public API, will stay stable for all non-breaking versions. If you release 1.0 and it has a certain feature, people should be able to upgrade to 1.10 and not have anything break. And to do that, we need to define what is that API, what are we promising won't change. It's really a matter of communication. And that communication allows people to upgrade packages without breakage, which lets people use the latest versions and not have to did you use base.printMatrix and now it doesn't work anymore? Like, whoops, that's not fun. So the problem here is in public but unexported names, base.isExpr and base.printMatrix are both unexported. So you have to access them with a qualified syntax that is base dot. You can't just type isExpr at the REPL. And they both have doc strings. So if I try to demo this, ooh, okay. This is the So that's the doc string of base.isExpr, and that's the doc string of base.printMatrix. So they both have doc strings. So we can't use either of those to determine which is which. And this creates an ambiguous API. And this is another, a subtle side effect, is it discourages documentation of internals. If base.print matrix wasn't documented, then no one would think it's public because you would have no idea what it's doing. And that's bad because we want people to document internals because it's good to document things so that people who do decide to intentionally depend on internals can do so more safely. So the solution here is to decouple the API and namespace to allow people to mark things like isExpr or base.fix2 or base.fix as public without exporting it into the namespace. Because sometimes a lot of people use your package and you don't want to clutter all their namespaces. For example, PKG has the public symbol update and the public symbol add. And we don't want anyone who says using PKG to get update and add in their namespace. We don't want to export those, but they are public. And so we add this public keyword. And that lets you say that a symbol is public without making the symbol exported. And the syntax here is the same as the export syntax, but it's semantically a no-op, no impact on namespace. It's introspectable with base.isPublic, which is similar to base.isExported, which will tell you, given a module and a symbol, whether that symbol is exported from the module. And perhaps the most important part about this is it supports tooling. So those doc strings in 1.11, which, do you have 1.11 on this? OK, we're not going to demo it. Or you can try. Yeah, great. In 1.11, we will have the ability to, when you ask for the help string, sorry, I'm being distracted. Is this 1.11? OK, great. Would you get the doc string of base.isExpr and then base. Yeah, great. And then base.print matrix? Perfect. OK, so look at this warning. The following bindings may be internal. They may change or be removed in future versions. So you don't have to use base.isPublic. You just ask for the doc string. And right with this documentation of internals is a warning that these are internals being documented. And so now there's no risk. You can document all the internals you want, and people aren't going to mistake those documented internals for public API. They still might use them, but that's another problem. So yeah, this is all coming out in 1.11, which is around the corner. The way you interpret whether things are marked public and how that works is if it's exported, then it's automatically public. And the API of a package, you can kind of assume, it usually will be the documented behavior of all the public symbols. So if there's some sort of undocumented behavior of a symbol, you probably can't depend on it. But if it's documented and it's public, then you can count on it to stay the same in future non-breaking versions. And you can just read the doc strings, and it'll tell you all you need to know. So for a package author, so that's what you do as a user. It's just go about your life, and the information will be presented to you. For a package author, there's one action item that I'd request you do when you have public unexported symbols. It'd be great if you marked them as public. And for most packages, the public API is fully exported, so there's nothing you need to do. And if you don't do this, it's going to be OK. The only impact is that when folks query the doc strings of those public unexported symbols, if they're not marked public, they'll get this warning, which is not ideal, but it's not catastrophic. Nothing will break. And no warnings will happen at runtime. Only tooling will be a little bit misled, and the doc string query will contain a warning. If you want to support previous versions of Julia before 1.11, which is quite sensible, then you won't be able to use the public keyword, because it's not a keyword in previous versions, but you can use compat.jl, which is a package that is great for letting you use new features of Julia with old versions. And so you can just use the @compat macro and say @compat public XYZ. And that will expand to a no-op in old versions of Julia and expand to the public declaration in new versions. An example is this is an example from base. It's the iterators module, and we can see the export list and the public list right below it. And same syntax. It's actually, this was kind of tricky. I'm now jumping from how you can relate to this as a package author, as a user, and jumping into how it was implemented, the backstory here. It's a little bit tricky to create a new keyword because keywords are reserved. You can't use them as variable names or as function names, and we're just adding this new public keyword. So we've explored several options for adding this in a non-breaking way. One of them is as a macro, the @public macro, which would be non-breaking, but it just doesn't. If you come to Julia and the syntax here isn't export public, it's export @public, that feels a little bit inconsistent. And I really, whenever possible, want to make these design decisions thinking about the future, thinking about folks who are going to be coming and Julia 1.12 is their first version that they ever see. I want it to seem cohesive. It could be an extension of export, and that has the added benefit of, or it could have been extension of export with a keyword like export scoped equals true or qualified equals true. But people found that confusing. That would have the advantage of you could be even more extensible with other tags. You might want to tag exported things as, say, exported in a certain version. And so we might end up adding keywords there anyway, but that's a future talk. And so what we ended up settling on for making this practically non-breaking is public is a conditional keyword. It is only a keyword at the top level, and only a keyword when it's followed by a symbol, as in this list. So if you have something in your code that uses public not at the top level, it'll still be treated as an identifier. And if you use public at the top level as a global variable, like public equals 7, that will be treated as an identifier. And if you have a function like public of x equals x plus 1, that will be treated as an identifier. It's only in this specific case, which was previously an error, that it becomes a keyword. So practically not breaking. In fact, technically not breaking. And hopefully in the future, people will use public as an identifier less because it's a keyword. And it's kind of bad practice to use a keyword as an identifier. And then we use package eval to just double check that it's not breaking, and it's not. Then there's some technical details of how this is implemented, similarly to export. So this is getting into the Julia object model, which is very internal. Bindings contain a bit for whether they're exported or not. And now we add, and there were spare bits. There was an 8-bit field or 3 bits of padding. We took one of those bits and used it to represent whether something's public or not. The names function, we changed so that names of a module now just returns the public names instead of all names. And that practically is a non-breaking change and allows for better discoverability. This way, the auto-generated README, the auto-generated doc string of a package can include a list of all the public names, which is great for discoverability. And if you call names of a package, you get all the public names, which, again, great for discoverability. There's a lot of bike shedding about the specific syntax for this public, as there always is, and that's probably for the best. It's good to have a lot of people talking about which syntax we want, because these are kind of permanent choices. And that discussion happened on GitHub and is open to anyone who's watching the GitHub repository. And then we redefined Julia's official public API to be, instead of the documented behavior, it's the documented public behavior. So that's following that same intersection that I was talking about earlier. It's the intersection of public and documented. That is the API you can count on to stay stable in future versions of Julia. And finally here, there's an interesting technical detail of nested publicity. If you have a submodule, then the submodule can be marked public, and then symbols within that submodule, if they're marked public, then that symbol can be counted on to stay stable. And whereas if you have something that's, oh, computer died, cool beans, I will just wing it from here. Give me 30 seconds. Oh, maybe it's just timed out. Oh, great. Perfect. Thank you, thank you. So if you have a non-public submodule, then anything within that submodule, even if it's public within that submodule, unless there's a continuous chain of publicity to it, will not be public to an outside user. Some future work in this domain of helping people communicate intent, helping people communicate APIs, are traits and abstract types and interfaces. It'd be great if we could have some sort of way of programmatically specifying those, possibly even formal specifications of the contracts of various functions. This is all far out, unclear if it'll ever happen, but things worth thinking about. Continuing to clarify doc strings, given how Julia communicates and facilitates communication between authors and users, clear doc strings are really quite an outstanding thing. So that's an ongoing future work. Marking symbols as public where appropriate is still ongoing. It'll be a bit before we've got all the public symbols that have accrued over time are actually marked public. So that's a lovely way to contribute. And behavior that's not tied to symbols. This is mostly the case with Julia, the language. Also the case a little bit with packages. If it's not tied to a symbol, then how do you formally specify that? I mean, you can just always tell people to read the manual, but if you have to read the whole manual of all the packages you use, I mean, go for it, I guess. That sounds like a great idea. But I think a lot of people want something more quickly accessible and more modularly accessible. You might want to know the public API of a part of a package, but you don't care about a different part. Marking fields of a struct as public is something that I think might be coming. Struct fields are private by default, but some struct fields are public, and it'd be nice to be able to programmatically specify that. And then this final point is the most, I would say, has the most potential to be changing culture, and that would be disabling access to internals by default. And then you could, so this would mean that if a symbol, thank you, is not public, you would need to specify that you depend on the internals of a package before you could use it. And what that would do is allow you to allow PKG to resolve versions with an awareness of what is public. I want to thank Claire Foster for inspiring this. At last JuliaCon, we talked about it, created this idea together. There's a lot of people who have had this idea before us, but in chats with Claire is where this happened. Code review and parsing. This is implemented in parsing. Thank you, Claire, for making the parser so nice to work with. And all the reviewers of the pull request and folks who have already helped by making symbols public. Thank you all. I think we have a bit of time for questions.
Yeah, so with tab completion hinting coming in, one of the questions is what we should do about completing things that aren't explicitly marked as public. And I guess a detail on that is if you have a package that hasn't opted in to flag anything as public, what do you do then? Do you just kind of treat everything as public or treat everything as internal?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. And this is not my decision. This is a consensus decision that we need to make as a community. I think that there is a class of packages that have a fully exported public API and should not be declaring anything public. And so I don't think we should special case packages that don't use the public keyword. I think that tab completion should still tab complete internals, at least for now, because I don't know about y'all, but I depend on tab completion. And that includes depending on tab completion for developing packages I'm writing, which means I need to tab complete internals. For the hints, the inline hints, I think those should only display for public things.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I was wondering also if you do tab completion and see multiple things, whether we should separate internal and public, or maybe like color code them or something.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely worth doing.
So I was wondering, so the public keyword works on just the bindings, right? So I can imagine that there are situations where you actually have methods that are tied to the same function, that where some of them are public and some of them aren't. Was that something that was considered?
Yes, yeah, that is something that was considered. The answer here is please don't have public methods and private methods on the same function. It's terrible. As somebody who's inherited a code base that has that, and now I'm like, oh, this feels so icky. Yeah, try not to do that. However, it's only the documented behavior that's public. So if you have some undocumented method, then that's not public. Now, if you have documented methods that are private and documented methods that are public on a single function, this doesn't help you. However, I think that's not a viable way to define an API because of the way dispatch works. It's tricky to know which method you're calling. So, like, as a user, I know that I'm calling a function, and I might not even know what types I'm passing to that function, because I might be writing a generic function that takes type any and passes it on to your function, and so then I don't know until runtime if I'm depending on internals, and that's just not a good API. And so, yeah, for the most part, the answer is just try not to do that. Okay, in the back stage right.
So if you import a private module that declares public members, I'll use the word members. Say you're in the REPL. Are those considered public? So it's like a private submodule from a public package, right? You've got a public package, it has a private subpackage in it, and you import a public member from that. Is that considered public or private in your context?
Yeah, so publicity is based on the binding. So when you imported that private submodule, that was accessing internals. And if you asked for the doc string of that private submodule, it would give you that warning of that's an internal module, and the whole module might disappear. Once you have that internal, if it defines public methods, public functions, public symbols, those would be considered public. So if we've got a module A and module B is an internal module of that and it has symbol C in it, then accessing B.C is good, that's fine, but accessing A.B is going to be accessing internals. So if you manage to get your hands on B somehow, maybe through a different API, then accessing C within B is fine. Does that answer the question? Great.
Up here to the left.
Thank you. I just want to be sure of the interface that I'm getting. If I don't do anything to my packages in White.11, I will get those warnings on my not exported doc strings for free, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
I just want to ask, is there anywhere in a situation where it makes sense to have a binding that is that is public but not exported, or should public always imply exported?
Yeah, so usually public things should be exported. However, sometimes it's a really common name that you don't want to pollute people who are using your package's namespace with. So, for example, scoped values is a standard library that defines the method get, the function get, and it's a different function than base.get. And it's a key part of the API of that package, so it's public, but they can't export get because everyone's already using base.get. So when you're worried about a name conflict, a naming clash, or if you just think a name is too common, or you don't want, if you've got a lot of names, like maybe unitful has a lot of names that, yeah, so many names in unitful that are public, but you don't want to pollute the namespace with.
Okay, makes sense. And the other way around, that you have something that's...
No, you do not want to put your internals into somebody else's namespace without them asking for it.
No.
Yeah, export implies public. If you have something, yeah, export implicitly implies public. If you have something that's exported, of course it's public. You shouldn't be exporting internals.
But is it like technically implied, or do I, as a package author, have to make sure that everything I export I also make public?
It's automatically done.
Okay.
Export, the keyword, makes it exported and makes it public.
All right, thank you.
Yep. And I think you'll get an error if you do declare it both ways. So the compiler will remind you.
We have time for one more question up here. Tim.
Has there been thought of an intermediate stage before sort of disabling access to internals, of having a period where there's an automated pull request to submit a new badge to all of the registered packages about their certification status with which they are using or not using internals of other things? And do you think that badge would be sufficiently motivating to get the ecosystem marking things as public to speed the transition? I think especially since public isn't in 1.10 and that's going to be the LTS, I do think as a community we need to think a little bit about how we encourage adoption of this.
Yeah. I think, so to have any sort of badge or any sort of notion of whether a package depends on internals requires another big technical leap, and that is tracking whether people are using internals. And so that's the technical aspect. And then there's this social aspect of how do we use that. I think one option is an opt-in to say, a package could say, I don't use internals of my dependencies, and set a flag somewhere, and then get that enforced. And then that could go with that could be a README badge. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of brainstorming to be done about this.
Yeah, basically it could go into Aqua, right?
Yeah, it could go,
You just, after lowering, you lower all the code in the package, and then you look and you see if it's accessing non-public things.
yeah.
It doesn't sound that difficult to add as an Aqua pass.
Yeah, it could totally be an Aqua pass. It wouldn't be perfect, but it would be very reliable, I think. Yeah.
All right, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you very much. Let's have another round of applause.